Welcome, everyone, to the Rise Hub seminar. I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Andy Castillo. He will be discussing kinetic modeling and theory of crossed field plasmas. Andy, please take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. My name's Andy. I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford. I'm going to talk about some of the research I've been doing here at Stanford. I'm a member of this research group in the Aeronautics and Astronautics department called Plasma Dynamics Modeling Laboratory, or PDML. The advisor is Dr. Kentaro Hara. And so in this group, we mainly do low temperature plasma type of modeling, and largely the applications are for electric propulsion. But I'll talk about some different types of stuff. But that's in general the types of stuff that we do: fluid models, kinetic models. And so if anyone has any more questions about PDML afterwards, I'm happy to discuss. So just quickly, just some acknowledgments. My advisor, of course, Dr. Hara. Also, one of these projects was through a fellowship called the Laboratory Residency Graduate Fellowship. And so that involves doing these summer residencies at a national lab, and for mine in particular is at Sandia. And so through those residencies, summer residencies, I also collaborated with Matthew Hopkins and Nichelle or Nikki Bennett. So I just wanted to acknowledge them as well. And lastly, Dr. Anubhav Dwivedi, who was a postdoc at PDML, but now is at the University of Minnesota. And so they really helped a lot with all this work. So the presentation outline, first I'll introduce kind of what I mean by cross-field plasmas in general, and then I'll talk about three different projects. The first one will be about 1D simulations of a plasma sheath when you have an oblique magnetic field. And the goal for that work will be try to use the simulations to develop a way to calculate what the sheath edge conditions as a function of, that angle of that magnetic field. The second part will be talking about electron E cross B shear flow that's happening in cross-field diodes and the shear flow instabilities that can arise, and just kind of reviewing the theory and proposing a better method for solving the growth rates. And then in part three, we'll use 2D simulations and we'll be benchmarking with the theory from part two. And then we'll kind of look at the effect of how the formation of plasma on the cathode surface, how that affects the overall growth of the instability. And we'll do that by varying the amount of electrons being injected from the cathode. And then finally, some conclusions and future work. So, okay. So cross-field plasmas, I kind of just mean in general just any a plasma being in an environment where the electric field and the magnetic field are perpendicular to each other. So that's a pretty broad general term. But I'm specifically going to talk about some devices in which these types of plasmas exist. And some examples are shown here on the left. First is a magnetically insulated transmission line, or a MIDL. These are components that are really important for pulse power systems, such as the Z machine at Sandia, which is the kind of the motivation for that project. And so looking at it in a kind of a simpler way, looking at a cross section, they kind of function sort of like a cross-field diode. And so you can see, due to the voltage on the anode, you have an electric field that's going on in the X direction, but then we also have a magnetic field that's perpendicular to it. So the plasma that can form on the electrode surfaces, they are essentially what I'm referring to as this cross-field plasma. In the center is a Hall effect thruster. This is used for plasma propulsion or electric propulsion. This is, I think, what I mentioned before. There's a lot of what is done in PDML in my research group. And this is another example where, again, due to an anode cathode setup here, you have an electric field and it's perpendicular to a different magnetic field that's happening. And it's and something I want to bring in is particularly about the Hall effect thruster, and that'll be important. And what I'm going to talk about is with the sheaths, is that, as you can see, the sheath region for the Hall effect thruster, the magnetic field has a certain contour, and so it'll be intersecting the wall at different types of angles, and that's something that'll be important. And then the last example is magnetrons, or any other type of examples with involving high power microwaves is also something where cross-field plasma shows up. So because this work is with kinetic simulations, we're really going to focus on regimes where the kinetic effects are important. So really, we're trying to look at what is the significance of the plasma wall interactions in these types of devices where you have cross-field plasmas. Uh, and in that sense, even devices where you don't have, I guess, the usual applied electric field and then magnetic field perpendicular to each other, in that near wall sheath region, you do have an electric field that's being set up due to the sheath, and that can be perpendicular to a magnetic field. And so those could also be what we could consider a cross-field plasma that we want to study. An example here is a tokamak, and I'm specifically focusing on the diverter region here, where again you can see the magnetic field is intersecting the wall at a certain angle, and of course due to the sheath you'll have an electric field that's more normal to the wall, and so. The motivations for this stuff is to try to understand better what the plasma wall interactions are when you have the magnetic fields lines at these angles, so that we can better understand the amount of heat flux that's going to, in this case, the target plate, because that's an important part for understanding this device and its efficiency. Another motivation is I previously showed the Hall effect thruster and how we also have magnetic field lines intersecting at certain angles. A phenomenon that happens in those devices is something called anomalous electron transport, in which the electron mobility is significantly different in experiments compared to the simulation. And one possible factor into that is, what the plasma wall interactions are like in these regions where the magnetic field is at a certain angle. And so that's why it's another important topic to want to understand better to help bring more physical understanding to this anomalous electron transport. And furthermore, beyond just exactly what's happening in that near wall region, the overall effect on the device is also something that we're motivated by. And here now I'm looking at a cross-field diode, and this is specifically for the midal example, where you would have a layer of electrons flowing on a cathode surface in a midal, as it's shown here. And this is kind of its ideal operation. Um, but something that's been shown to happen in midals is that you can have a contaminant plasma that forms due to just a contaminant material being on the electrode surface, and due to the high current that's passing through these electrodes, it gets heated up, and you get a contaminant plasma that can form. And essentially, that contaminant plasma, the effect of what's happening in this near wall region, can enhance something called shear flow instabilities, or also referred to as a Kelvin-Helmholtz type instabilities. And so these shear flow instabilities can lead to expansion of the electron and the plasma, and that's pretty detrimental to the device, specifically for midals. That's kind of taking away current than what is supposed to go towards that central load of your pulse power system. This is called current loss, or also it's been referred to as parasitic current. So that's another way that we want to see how near wall effects can be affecting the overall efficiency of the device through this enhancement or not of shear flow instabilities. So first, I'll talk about the plasma sheaths, where we have that magnetic field at a certain angle, and the goal here is to use kinetic simulations to try to be able to analytically determine what are the conditions at the sheath edge, and that way we can learn more about how these sheaths behave, and it can also help with actual modeling of these devices by having the right boundary conditions. If you're using, per se, maybe a fluid model, and you want to have a boundary condition for what that sheath edge regime is. So it's also helpful in that sense. And so first I'll just do a very quick review of what I'm talking about with, a sheath, and how we go from what it's like in a non-magnetized sheath to a magnetized sheath. So here I'm just showing the setup that I'm going to be talking about, one in which the wall is a dielectric wall, or potentially floating, and it's containing a bulk plasma. And you can see here like the three main regions that are occur. There's the bulk plasma region, where potentials around zero. There's essentially no drift, quasi-neutral region. You then have a collisional pre-sheath region, which essentially functions to accelerate ions to a certain point, where then we have at this location what's called the Debye sheath edge. The Debye sheath edge is determined by the ion density gradient being less than electron density gradient, that's when you'll have a clear separation of the density gradients, and you'll have a formation of positive space charge here. And it's been found, it's been derived in the non-magnetized case that at this sheath edge location, the ion velocity has been accelerated to its the sound speed, or the Bohm velocity, which I'm showing here in normalized by thermal velocity units. So this is kind of how like a regular sheath works. Once you add a magnetic field with a certain angle, like an angle theta, what's been shown in the literature, specifically by the work by Kodura, is you get what's an additional pre-sheath region between the collisional pre-sheath and the Debye sheath, and this is called a magnetic pre-sheath. And basically, it has essentially a similar function to the collisional pre-sheath. It's also functions to accelerate ions to a sheath edge condition. And it's been found in the work by Kodura that the conditions at the magnetic pre-sheath edge is that the ion velocity parallel to the magnetic field is at the Bohm velocity. And so the expectation would be then that it's been accelerated to that point, that the parallel velocity is equal to Bohm velocity. Then you'd expect through the magnetic pre-sheath, it would be further accelerated such that probably the velocity perpendicular to the wall is at the Bohm velocity. But that's precisely what we want to determine. And so the magnetic pre-sheath has been known to vary and have dependence on, the amplitude magnetic field and the angle, of course. And so we'll kind of benchmark a simulation to show that we get those same results of the pre-sheath. But ultimately, the goal is really focusing on this condition. What is, the Debye sheath edge condition? This is really where you go into the separation between where a fluid model could work well into like now the fully kinetic regime of the Debye sheath. And so really trying to determine what are the sheath edge conditions where you get this formation of positive space charge. And so we do this with a particle and cell simulation. Here I'm just showing a schematic of how it's going to work. Well, it's one-dimensional, and on the left we'll have the source of plasma, where we'll be injecting an equal amount of fluxes of ions and electrons. On the right is the dielectric wall, and we'll have a magnetic field of, a certain angle theta. We'll inject the electrons with a biased Maxwellian distribution, and the ions will be injected with a certain drift velocity that's directed along the magnetic field. And we've, done verification studies in the non-magnetized case to, retrieve that we get the correct, potential drops, and we're able to verify through that. And essentially, what we're going to do with this model is we're going to do two different types of injection methods. The first one is we'll inject the ions at the condition that's the pre-sheath entrance. So that'll be injecting such that the velocity parallel is the Bohm velocity. So then we would expect to get the magnetic pre-sheath and the Debye sheath. And that'll mainly be just for benchmarking purposes. And then the next injection method that we're going to do is injection with what is the expected Bohm condition, which is that the perpendicular velocity is equal to the Bohm velocity. And that's where we'll see if this does a good job of matching up well with what the actual, non-magnetized sheath edge conditions are. And so here I'm showing here some steady state results of the potential distribution, where again, like the red lines are when we inject with the magnetic pre-sheath condition. So this is where we expect to get a magnetic pre-sheath and the Debye sheath. I'm showing in the column on the left with cold ions, and on the right with warm ions. So first with warm ions, we get the expected behavior of the magnetic pre-sheath, which is kind of like sort of a near linear drop in potential, followed by the more exponential drop of the Debye sheath. And this is in agreement with the work by Kodura. And you can see how that magnetic pre-sheath varies as you increase the angle of the magnetic field. For the cold ion case, you get these standing oscillations that occur, and this is actually also what is shown in Kodura's work. So that's also works as benchmarking to show that we get the same results there. But really, this is for benchmarking purposes. The focus we want to focus on is doing the Bohm injection and seeing if that does a good job of replicating what the sheath edge conditions are supposed to be. And so you can see, for example, for the case of 60 degrees. The blue curves now injecting with the Bohm condition, how the potential is fairly flat until you get to the significant drop of the Debye sheath. And this shows that it does a good job of of replicating what the sheath edge conditions are, because the domain size here for these simulations are about 35 Debye lengths, where an actual sheath, as for the case that we have here, we're working with hydrogen ions, it will just only be a few Debye lengths. And so essentially what happens is if you inject from the source on the left with the correct sheath edge conditions, then essentially the properties will just be remained constant until it reaches physically close to the wall, in which case you'd have the actual sheath. And so these are the expectations of results showing that this is what the sheath edge conditions are. But as we go to higher magnetic field angles, you can see how we start getting these different potential structures, either a potential bump near the injection or a potential bump close to the sheath edge. And that's where we start to see that this is no longer really replicating what the sheath edge condition, either due to numerical effects or physical effects. And so what I'm going to focus on in this talk is the the physical aspect of why at a higher field angle this condition will no longer be accurate for describing the sheath edge. And the manner that we're going to do this is by looking at the velocity distribution functions. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a result. So here was an example of, field angle of 60 degrees. And like I said before, if we look at this region where it's basically quasi-neutral, the potential is close to zero, we can gather all the electrons here, and we can plot its VDF, and we can consider that to be the sheath edge VDF, because as we saw, if it's flat right before this drop off, it's essentially the conditions of the sheath edge. And so that way we can get very nicely resolved VDFs, and we can study, physically what's happening and what's causing this deviation from the non-magnetized theory. And so that's essentially the way that we'll be doing this analytical framework. And so what I'm showing here now, focusing on the electrons from that region, from that flat region, what I'm going to show here is all the electrons that were repelled by the sheath for different field angles. And so first we can see, just to confirm, how it normally works in non-magnetized case, for a field angle of 0, you essentially recover the non-magnetized work. And you can see how the repelled electrons have, a vertical line truncation as expected, and due to the electrostatic repulsion of the sheath. But now as you have higher field angles, you can see how you get this unique cone-like structure. And that's essentially due to the angled gyro motion of the electrons as they're traveling to the wall. Before these electrons can essentially be reflected by the sheath, due to their gyro motion, due to a certain finite Larmor radius, they'll essentially be absorbed by the wall before they can be repelled. And hence that's where we get this sort of cone-like a structure that occurs that modifies the sheath edge of VDF. And so we can see kind of physically where this is coming from. And so essentially the goal is to characterize this sort of lost cone truncation for different field angles. And then by doing that, we can then have a characterization of sheath edge VDFs, and we can use, the 0th moment of that or the first moment of that to now rederive the sheath edge conditions. And so basically by what we're going to do now is characterize this VDF, and we're going to do it in a kind of simple way. First of all, we're going to calculate what's the minimum, parallel velocity of that reflected electron. So like this is, I guess, the electron that got, the closest to the wall before it was reflected away. And so that's what this parameter is, the SE is for sheath edge, and the parallel is the minimum value. Where you'll notice something interesting is that for the case of 60 degrees is that minimum parallel velocity is actually it has more is, I guess, that energy of the reflected electron has more energy than the sheath potential energy, which is an interesting observation. How could it return with more kinetic energy than what's the potential of the sheath well? So that's an interesting thing that we'll look at first, and that will help define this minimum point. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll just kind of come up with a simple just single value to describe the angle of the lost cone truncation. And with these two, we'll be able to have a characterization of these VDFs. So first, with that minimum parallel velocity point, what we did, sorry, jumping back real quick, is we took the electron from that minimum point, from the tip of this cone, and we just analyzed its trajectory, its journey from the injection source to the wall, and then when it gets reflected. And that's what I'm showing in this figure here. I'm showing, on the left, as it journeys to the wall, it then gets repelled, and then it comes back to the source, and you can see the evolution of the velocities on the top figure, and in the bottom you'll see the evolution of the kinetic energy, and here the corresponding potential energy of the well. And basically what you see is that as the electron travels to the wall, it seems to its extra kinetic energy that it would have that would make it be absorbed by the wall gets funneled into the E cross B drift direction, because of course as you get closer to the wall, the electric field becomes stronger, and so the E cross B drift becomes significant there. And so it seems that, as you can see, the velocity in the Z direction becomes significant right at the wall, while the others go essentially to zero. And so that's how come we were able to see before a tip of the cone that could go, beyond what the potential energy is of the sheath. It's because we have this E cross B drift velocity that is creating this effect here. And so that's how we're able to essentially get an expression for what that minimum parallel velocity is. Partially due to this first term is to, of course, the potential of the sheath, and then the second term is an approximation of that E cross B drift velocity at the wall. So yeah, these are potentials, phi W's potentials at the wall. So now we have that value. The next thing will be the truncation angle. And essentially we'll do that by just generalizing our expression for that, minimum parallel velocity, but for any perpendicular velocity, so that way we can, map it out for that whole loss cone. But as we go through different parallel velocities, we're going to define use the sheath potential energy and E cross B drift velocity at a certain critical turnaround point, where here we want to account for the fact that, yes, as the electron is traveling towards the wall and it's gyrating, it's likely can't get any closer to the wall than once its, projected Larmor radius is, touching that wall. And so that's how we get this critical turnaround point that, beyond this point, it wouldn't be able to be repelled. It would likely be absorbed by the wall. And so that's how we define this point. We do include an empirical constant to help agree with the simulation. That's because, there's also effectively, what's the phase of the gyration that's currently at. It could potentially get a little bit closer to the wall. So that's why there's this additional, just a single value to help with that agreement. But that's how we define this sort of truncation line. And so that's the green line that I'm showing here for a sheath edge VDF. The green line showing how it kind of outlines that loss cone pretty well. And then just to make it simpler, we just take the slope, at a zero perpendicular velocity and then a perpendicular velocity of like around 4 to get the red curve, or like the red dotted line. So just to get just a single angle instead of having an actual curve, just this angle instead. And so that's what I'm showing on the right, is how, that truncation angle increases from, of course, zero at zero angle of magnetic field, increasing to a larger value once it gets closer to 90 degrees. And so just to show how those characterized VDFs look with the simulation, here I'm showing for several different field angles the sheath edge VDFs from the simulations, and then the red lines is that truncation line that we got from our previous analysis. And so you can see how it does a pretty decent job of replicating that loss cone behavior. And so now that we have this, now that we can, for any field angle, we can calculate what the sheath edge VDF is. Like I said before, we'll use, the 0th moment to calculate densities and the first moment to calculate velocities, and we can now rederive sheath edge conditions. And so what we'll do is we'll derive two different expressions for what the ion velocity is at the sheath edge. The first expression comes from the usual derivation of the Bohm condition, which involves using Poisson's equation and assuming quasi-neutrality, and taking a Taylor expansion and then applying that that assumption that we have a monotonic sheath and that we will have, the ion density gradient not falling as much as electron density gradient. And with that, you get to this expression where the ion velocity will be a function of the gradient of electron velocity at the sheath edge, where again, this electron density will be calculated using those characterized VDFs from before. And so uh, that'll be one way to calculate it, but you can see it's a function of two variables. It's a function of the potential at the wall, and it's a function of the field angle. The second way that we calculate the ion velocity is by, knowing that also at the sheath edge, another condition is that the ion velocity and the electron velocity are equal to each other. So essentially, we'll just take the first moment of that, loss cone VDF, and we'll equate it to the ion velocity. So that one's a little bit simpler. And so now we have, two different definitions for ion velocity. And so what I'm showing here is the results for those two as a function of, potential at the wall for different field angles. And essentially when these two curves intersect is when you'll have your solution. And so with this framework that we've established, you can essentially calculate what is the potential drop at the wall and what is the ion velocity at the sheath edge as a function of your magnetic field angle, where both of them, as expected, they become smaller as your magnetic field angle becomes more and more parallel to the wall. And so that was the main contribution from this work. Okay, so that was part one. Now we're done with the sheaths and we're done with field angles, certain field angles. Now everything's going to be perfectly perpendicular to each other. And so now I'm going to focus on the electron shear flow of that cross-field diode. First here with the theory and then next with the simulations. And this part with the theory, the main part of this section is that we're going to show a different solution method than what's usually used and showing its advantages and different physical insights that we got from that. And so here I got the cross-field diode again from before, and we want to, determine the growth rates of that shear flow instability that I mentioned before. And so to do that, first we'll do a linear stability analysis. So I'm just going to review that here. And so we start with an equilibrium state that I'm showing here. The equilibrium state will be defined by having an electron density gradient that varies in the x direction, which I'm showing here, and not x. And that electron density gradient can be any distribution, electron density distribution can be any distribution you like, but it's just, it's varying just in the x direction. Then we also assume the equilibrium state that the flow of the electrons is following just E cross B drift velocity. So that's why we have the E over B. So that's determining what the equilibrium state of the electron velocities are. And then finally, for the electric field, we're going to assume that we are in space charge limited conditions. And this is a common assumption when we're in, simulations for midals and for studying these types of instabilities. And so by doing that, we're assuming that the electric field is going to be 0 at the cathode. And by doing that and combined with Gauss's law, the expression of the electric field ends up becoming pretty simple. It's just the integral of the density. And due to this setup of the equilibrium state, you get an important relation that's going to be, I'll bring it up again later because it'll be important, but that essentially that the gradient of the velocity then, because it's gradient of E cross B drift, is equal to just this ratio of, plasma frequency squared over gyro frequency. So that's our equilibrium state, and we're going to perturb it. We'll perturb it in a way such that the amplitude of the perturbation can vary in the x, but the wave number will be just in the y direction, and that's just been shown from previous work that the y direction is really the only unstable mode in these type of shear flows. So I won't get into the details of that, but that's just shown from previous work. So that's why the wave number is just in the y, and we'll have the perturbation quantities for the electric fields in the x and the y, and then velocity in the x and the y, and the density. So with these perturbed quantities, we'll take the linearized equations that are governing the system, which will be continuity, cold momentum, Gauss, and Faraday's law. And so in momentum, so momentum x and y, so that's why we'll have 5 equations and we have the 5 unknowns. I'm also going to express them in these normalized variables. The one important normalization to keep note of is that all the frequencies will be normalized by the gyro frequency. And so that's an important normalization to keep note of. And this parameter Q that I'm going to be using, which is a common parameter to use, which is plasma frequency squared over gyro frequency squared. And that's essentially just like a normalized electron density. But this will also be important to keep note of. That Q is essentially normalized density, but it's, yeah, this ratio. I'm going to show, we have these 5 equations and we're going to solve for them. We'll solve for one parameter. I'm going to solve for the perturbed electric field in the Y, but I'm going to refer to it in terms of this this phi variable, this potential. And so we combine these 5 equations and we put it together, and you end up with this singular eigenvalue equation, this second order eigenvalue equation here. And essentially, this is the equation that we want to solve for. We want to get the eigenvalues omega, and where the imaginary component, that would be the growth rate of the instability. And so first I'll note a few interesting things about this equation that will come up later, and that's that there are several expressions in this equation which are essentially resonance expressions. The first one, S, is omega minus KUY. This is essentially just a Doppler shifted frequency. When this is equal to 0, it has been referred to as a synchronous resonance in the literature. The second one is when the Doppler shifted frequency is equal to 1. But remember, the normalization is by gyro frequency. So essentially, this is when the Doppler shifted frequency is equal to gyro frequency. And of course, when that is 0, we get a gyro resonance. The last one, which is not discussed too much, but this will be an interesting thing to talk about, is that there's an additional expression here that when this is equal to 0, you get a modified gyro resonance where the gyro frequency is reduced by the plasma frequency. And we'll get into the physical meaning of that in a bit. But an important thing to realize is that these resonant expressions are in the denominators of this equation. And so that's one thing to keep note. So this is the equation we want to solve, and the main part of this section is to propose a different solution methodology. And so first I'll talk about how it's normally done. And the normal way to solve this equation is, of course, first you'll need your input conditions. You need your distribution of Q, or effectively the electron density, and velocity, and a certain K. And essentially you solve for the eigenvalues omega and eigenvectors phi using something called the shooting method. And in this method, it relies on, first of all, the boundary conditions, which is that phi is 0 at the cathode and at the anode. And so with knowing those boundary conditions, the shooting method, essentially what it does is it takes this boundary value problem and it recasts it as an initial value problem. And what it'll do is it'll start maybe at one side, maybe at the cathode side, knowing that phi is 0, and it'll take a guess for what the solution is. It'll guess a certain eigenvalue omega, and then it will solve the ODE over to across to the right side, and then it'll check, is phi 0, did it meet the right boundary condition? And if it doesn't, then you have to iterate and you choose a different eigenvalue. And so that's kind of how the shooting method essentially works. And so essentially this process, as you heard, like, it's something that involves a needing initial guess, and it's an iterative process where you have to keep going to get a solution. And for example, let's say you have more than one solution to the equation, you'd have to restart it multiple times to get all the different solutions. So what we'll propose here instead is to transform that previous equation, instead of solving it as a shooting method, but to transform it into a polynomial eigenvalue problem. And we essentially do that by multiplying through by the denominator expressions, such that now the equation will essentially be of this form, where every term now has a polynomial expression of omega. And by doing that, you can then pull phi out from it, and you can have this omega times these expressions with phi, and you get this polynomial problem now, where the second and first derivatives will discretize them with central differencing, and so this capital A will essentially become the coefficient matrices of the polynomial problem. You can take it further and you can make it a generalized eigenvalue problem. You could take that polynomial problem from before and you can manipulate it further, and you can turn it into this now with this much larger matrix equation. But by putting it in this much larger form, we now get this generalized eigenvalue problem, which is shown here. The only thing is that now we're dealing with much larger matrices. As you can see, the A matrices are now embedded in this much larger matrix, and so these capital L and R matrices are larger, and they depend on, the order of the polynomial problem. But this is essentially another way of being able to solve it as a generalized eigenvalue problem. So now I'll just show a comparison between these three different methods. There's the shooting method, there's a polynomial method, and there's a generalized eigenvalue method. And so first, I'll give some input conditions. So here I'm showing a distribution for Q, or essentially the electron density. The equation that I'm using here is based off of kinetic simulations from another work, where they fit a line to their average simulation results. So this is kind of an expected uh, profile from, electron layer on in these crossfield diodes. Um, and then there's the corresponding velocity distribution. And so we take these inputs and we put it into that eigenvalue equation. And what I'm showing here is the eigenvalue solutions through those three different methods. The blue circles is the shooting method, where you get these two solutions, which they had to be, of course, obtained independently using different initial guesses. But through the polyeig and eig solvers, which is MATLAB's QZ factorization methods for solving these eigenvalue problems, you get these additional solutions in addition to the ones that the shooting method also was able to get. And so, of course, the main advantage is that with these eigenvalue formulation, you don't have to use initial guess. You get all the solutions at once. And as you see here, we get this additional branch of solutions that the shooting method did not obtain. And so what we're going to focus on is try to understand, first confirm that these solutions, at least some of them, are connected to shear flow instability. And the ones that are not, what do they mean physically, and why did the shooting method not get them? So as you see, there's this branch of solutions here that shooting method did not get. And so to get a little bit more insight, we decide to plot on top of the solutions, which are the black dots, what are the resonant frequencies that are occurring in this electron layer. And so you can see the synchronous, the gyroresonance, and the modified gyroresonance all appear on, of course, on the real axis. And they are not associated with that separated solution that the shooting method was able to get. But now you see that this extra branch of solutions that we got from eig comes from the modified gyro resonance. And as you can see, it's now pretty clear in the expression for it here that when Q is larger than 1, that's when you get an imaginary component, and hence that's why you would get this branch. And so essentially, this branch here is referring to the location in that electron density profile where Q is larger than 1, and then once Q is less than 1, it's down here. And so now we get some more insight into what this branch is, like at least where it comes from. It's connected to this modified gyroresonance. And we can see that the shooting method was not able to get these solutions because they're resonant solutions, and they were singularities in the equation. So when the shooting method was trying to obtain these solutions, when it would reach the location of the singularity, it would just, it would blow up. So that's how come it was not able to get them. But now the question remains is, this Q greater than 1 branch, does it really mean anything? And just to put a little bit more into context, in usual studies of midals and crossfield diode flows, the profiles usually have Q equal to 1 or Q less than 1, where Q equal to 1 is called a Brillouin flow. And this is just due to observations in the device that either Q equal to 1 or Q less than 1 is often desired, or just what is observed. And so when I made this input condition here, oops, sorry, I put Q greater than 1 to see what would happen in this regime, and that's where we get this additional branch. But then I'll talk about physically what that means in a little bit. But first, I'll just do a quick confirmation that that isolated solution that we got with the shooting method is associated with the shear flow instability. And so now I'm just showing the results again, but for different input conditions, different variations in the electron density. as you can see, of course, from the solutions of the eigenvalue solutions, that when Q is less than 1, then you don't get this additional branch. And here in the box solutions are the, isolated ones that the shooting method was able to get. So I'm just going to show for these isolated solutions what their dispersion relation looks like, and that way we'll be able to confirm that they are indeed associated with shear flow instability. So I took those 3 box solutions for different input conditions, and I plotting here the real and the imaginary components as of for a range of k, so essentially showing the dispersion relation. And essentially, we were able to recover the same behavior from regular shear flow instabilities. For example, here in the growth rate in the bottom, we see that we have these 2 peaks, and they're associated with essentially different types of resonances that are involved in these types of instability. The first peak is a long wavelength mode associated with synchronous resonance. But once you go to a higher enough wave number, you can start to have a gyroresonance, which is this secondary peak, sometimes referred to as magnetron instability. And of course, the growth rates increasing with increasing electron density is also something found in the literature. So we're essentially confirming that those isolated solutions are from shear flow instability. And so the only thing that remains now is to look into those results that had the modified gyro frequency connection. And to do that, I'll just recall that expression that we talked about before, which is that the electron velocity gradient is connected to plasma frequency squared over gyro frequency. And so when I was talking about the modified gyro frequency, in non-normalized terms, it looks like this. It's a gyro frequency that's reduced by plasma frequency. But if we take apart where it came from, it comes from the gradient and the electric field. And now this expression here is now a more well-known effect of electron gyration, which is that when you have E cross B environment and the electron is gyrating, if the electric field has a gradient, it will actually modify the frequency at which it's gyrating. And here on the right, I'm showing some example particle trajectories where if you have a, let's say, negative electric field gradient, then the frequency of gyration is essentially being reduced. And so you have essentially a larger average Larmor radius. And by extension, if we further reduce the gradient of the electric field, make it more and more negative, you can see there'll be a point in which this expression in the square root will become negative. And so that's when essentially the frequency would become imaginary. And so what does that mean? And essentially what that means is that what I'm showing on the right here, that once the gradient just becomes just slightly negative enough to make the this frequency expression imaginary, is that you would no longer have gyration. The electron would no longer essentially be confined by the magnetic field, but you'd actually get an acceleration. And it's this detrapping effect that's called trajectory instability. And so now we get a little bit more understanding of what these solutions are. Essentially, because my input condition had a region where you have Q greater than 1, all these solutions here are just signaling that, oh, this is the electron detrapping mechanism at work. This is because the gradient is so large, the electrons are going to be accelerated from that region. Where in our specific case for cross-field diodes, it's when the plasma frequency is larger than the gyro frequency for this specific case because its connection to the electric field gradient. And so what that means in terms of the simulations that have been shown that Q is usually around equal to 1 is that I think what we're proposing here is essentially the method in which Q equal to 1 is generally produced, which is that if you'd have any region where Q is larger than 1, that detrapping mechanism would accelerate the electrons out of that region and therefore would reduce the electron density or reducing Q such that it would no longer have that instability anymore. And so we hypothesize, as this is I'd say at least a factor into why the electron flow tends to be in this Q equals 1 state. Okay, so very quickly, I'll just talk about some simulations where here we're benchmarking with the theory that I was just talking about, and we're going to determine if, the amount of electrons that are being injected from the cathode surface, that evolution of that near wall state, does that impact the overall growth of the instability? And so briefly just talking about the simulation setup, here's essentially what it'll look like. It'll be a cathode on the left and then anode on the right. It's a 2D particle and cell. It's collisionless electrostatic, and it's with electrons only. We'll be injecting a certain fixed amount of electron current density uniformly all along the cathode surface, and we'll have periodic boundary conditions on the top, and then of course the enforcing the potentials of 0 and of 12 kilovolts for the cathode and anode respectively. So briefly just talking about the different injection currents, just because I'm going to be varying the injection current, so just a few parameters to keep in mind. That near Brillouin state of Q around equals to 1 is been an expected a result that's been shown from simulations whenever you inject above something called a critical current, which is this expression here. As you can see, the critical current or critical current density is a function of this of the magnetic field that's in the diode, but also this magnetic field cutoff parameter B sub h, where that's considered the minimum magnetic field to insulate an electron, like stop an electron from just barely reaching the anode. And also it's a function of Chard-Langmuir law. So you can think of this critical current as the current necessary to reach a space charge limited condition in a cross-field diode. For our specific setup, the critical current is 2 times 10 to the 5, and Chard-Langmuir law is 6.5 times 10 to the 5. So I'm going to first show results with injecting at somewhere in between, so 3 times 10 to the 5. And what I'm going to show here on the left panel is the evolution of Q, or essentially the electron density. And on the right, I'm going to show the electric field in the Y direction. Whereas if we see the growth there, that will be associated with the growth of the instability. And so again, the electrons are injected from the left, and so you'll see that first wave come out and be reflected by or return back by the magnetic field, and you'll get electrons building on the cathode surface. And essentially, once it reaches the space charge limited condition, this huge layer of electrons just gets shedded, and that initiates that sort of perturbation to then lead into the shear flow instability. As you can see, the electric field in the Y, it's starting to grow in magnitude, and you can see the waves starting to form in the electron density. And so this is a pretty nice setup, is a pretty nice solution, and it's very interesting to see how something like this can form with not too complicated of a setup. Uh, yeah, we see this. Yeah, this layer of electrons that come off, and that starts seeding that those initial changes, and it goes right into the shear flow instability. So I'll just quickly summarize. We compare with the theory. We do this by averaging in time and in the Y direction, the simulation. So I'm showing here on the right the growth of the electrostatic energy. So like in this region where it's flat, that's where I'm going to average the density profiles, and that's what I'm showing on the left. This is like the averaged electron density profile, and that's what's going to be the input condition for the theory, and that's the blue line here where we get some good agreement. So okay, just to wrap up real quick, essentially I varied the injection current, and basically that leads to different initial, transient effects, different ways that the electrons evolve in the beginning. But I'm just skipping through here. But overall, what I wanted to show is that even though the near wall dynamics is changing for different amount of electrons being injected, the overall growth rate is unaffected for the most part. So here I'm showing is from the simulations the growth rate, and then on the bottom the current density. And so as long as you inject above critical current, you can see how like the growth rate stays relatively constant, and it's also relatively similar to a different injection method that I did, which is a space charge limited injection, which is an injection that tries to maintain an electric field of 0. And so these results showed a lot of different types of individual features of how electrons build up on the cathode or not, and different oscillation type stuff. But overall, the growth rate is not affected too much. And so that's essentially concluding what was going on there. So just in conclusions, we did some 1D simulation stuff. The goal was to determine sheath edge conditions. Then with the shear flow theory, we wanted to propose a different solution method. And we also wanted to highlight this detrapping effect. It's something that's been talked in space plasma, but it hasn't really been talked about in crossfield diodes. So we just wanted to bring that conversation to crossfield diodes. And then lastly, with the 2D simulations, really just trying to benchmark, and then also showing that, above a certain amount of injection, above a certain amount of formation, the effect on the growth rate is not too much, at least with just the electrons. The next step would be to incorporate an actual contaminant plasma, and that's where we would see really if it has a big impact on the shear flow instability. And that's it. I'll end it there. So that's, I guess, hopefully around 50 minutes. And Yeah, thank you guys for
Excellent.
listening, and I'll take any questions. Happy to answer anything.
Thank you so much, Andy, for a great presentation.
Oh,
We have a
thank you.
question from Richard in the chat. So he says, thank you, Andy. Can you tell us a little bit about the size of your PIC calculations, how many particles, how long they take, and the size of the computational resources?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. With the 1D pick simulations, they're of course much simpler. It wouldn't take too long. These were parallelized. They would use particle decomposition, and we like I said, we'd have like around 35 Debye links for that simulation domain, and everything is in normalized parameters. And we would have around 10 cells per Debye link, so we'd have pretty well resolved. And we would have around 3,000 particles per cell. We can of course get away with that because it's 1D, and we want to have really nice, really resolved VDF. So that's why we have a lot of particles per cell. But even then, with the parallelization, and I think it didn't even use too many processors, like 16 processors. It wouldn't take too long. This project's a little older, so I don't remember exactly off the top of my head how long it took, but I'd say no more than an hour or so, maybe a few hours at most. But that's how it was for the 1D pick. With the 2D, um, also parallelized, and I should also I should say more about this. So this code that I worked with is a code called XPick, and this is what we use in our lab. It's something that was developed by other members at PDML, and it actually also works in 3D, but here I'm just using it in its 2D formulation, and it's electrostatic and it's collisionless, and it's also parallelized. This one using domain decomposition. Um, this one using much more process. I think I was running these with 64 processors. Uh, and here we have the discretization, like the number of cells in each direction. Here, the number of electrons per cell, I guess, varies a lot, right? Because there are certain regions where there's just, pure vacuum, right? And so, but I'd say like in the regions where like the density is pretty significant, maybe around Q equals to 1, there was maybe 100 to 300 particles per cell. I'd say it's around there. And this simulation actually also did not take too long. It would take, I think, also on the order of an hour or two, somewhere like that. But yeah, that's what this code is like. And we also, because this involved working with Sandia National Labs, I also worked with a code there called Aleph, and did this also the same test setup, and was able to get good qualitative agreement between these results and what was the Sandia codes.
Great, thank you.
I encourage folks to get their questions in the chat. Andy, I'm curious, if we
Oh yeah.
wanted to follow these simulations, do you have any current publications that we can look for?
Oh yes. I think this one right here, the 17 here at the bottom, the one that I
Okay.
put here, if you'd like to note this one down,
Mhm.
I guess I must have put it there if at least references it, I guess. But yeah, this was probably referencing the code itself. There's no
Mhm.
publication on this specific setup right now with XPick, but yeah, like I said before, it's been used for other things, and
Mhm.
it's been used in 3D formulation. And I think yeah, hopefully this reference that I put here will point you to in the right direction, I hope, if that's right.
Excellent. Excellent. Does anyone else have any questions for Andy?
I've got one more if nobody else has one.
Yeah.
Go for it, Richard.
Great work, Andy. Yeah, so I was wondering this specific setup where you've got the shear flow instability developing. It seems pretty specific because you've got the boundaries and then you've got the electron layer being produced. But I was just wondering, are there any other kind of astrophysical or large scale analogs to this problem that you could make connections to, or is it pretty specific for this type of geometry?
Oh no, thank you. No, yeah, that's a great question. No, yeah, there's definitely a lot of different ways in which these instabilities manifest themselves. And yeah, I was confining myself here to the setup of a cross-field diode, where yeah, we have this boundary conditions of this anode uh, potential and this cathode voltage. Uh, but and that's of course relevant for the mitals and maybe other high power microwave applications. But it's definitely this shear-flow instabilities, I guess in a more general sense, have been called the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, and that's really associated with the space plasma aspect. And those type of work, those simulations are kind of more, I guess, not really bounded in that sense. Like you wouldn't have the cathode and the anode, you just have just the electron layer, and then the applied magnetic field. And because of the space charge of the electric layer, that's that's having the electric field that's perpendicular to the magnetic field. So essentially you'd have like, this eye that kind of forms and just kind of evolves. And so that's kind of what those simulations look like. But yeah, those are definitely relevant towards, magnetosphere type of plasmas. That's where it'd be pretty relevant.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Awesome, Andy. I guess I had one final question. So with these 2D simulations, what are you finding to be the biggest hurdle?
Oh, the biggest hurdle? That's a good question. I guess one big thing with these is that there's a big gradient in the density, and right now our code is like we have just a sort of a simple Cartesian mesh, and so the electron density like right on the cathode surface can be like very large, and then it can kind of drop off, and then like it'll drop off a lot into vacuum. And so right now I've just been working with just like a fixed cell size, but something that could make it better was to have like maybe something more variable, and that way that we could really for sure confirm that we have things well resolved. I did do a sort of a convergence study to land upon these cell discretizations, but ultimately it's still kind of a question mark that like, oh, maybe if I'm not resolving the debye length very well right at the cathode surface, maybe that could be making an impact. So I think that big like difference in magnitude, maybe I can show. I guess it's not a huge difference here, but like maybe like in this very small region, the density could go up even a lot more. So being able to resolve these regions, or at least determine if they need to be resolved, is I guess one big factor.
Awesome, awesome. Well, again, thank you for a wonderful presentation. If we don't have any further questions, then we can conclude here. So thank you very much, Andy.
Of course. Thank you guys very much. Thank you for attending and for listening. Thank you.